So now we come to the last presentation of this session. This is by Mr. Lennert Lapeere. He's again a PhD candidate and affiliated to the Historical Archaeological Research Group of Northwest Europe, Department of Archaeology, Ghent University, Belgium. So welcome, Mr. Lapeere, and over to you, please.
Yeah, I will tell something totally different. I will give a presentation on Earthfast posts and timber framing in late medieval Flanders. It's about archaeological and building historical study of urban housing in the county. First of all, I will situate the county of Flanders because I suspect not everyone knows where it is. It's situated in the current provinces of West and East Flanders in Belgium, also in Zealand in the Netherlands, and in the region French Flanders around the city of Lille in northern France. It's just that part of northern France. During the late Middle Ages, Flanders was one of the most densely populated and urbanized regions of northwestern Europe. It was comparable with the city-states of northern Italy. And just as an example, the biggest city, Ghent, had at that time 60,000 inhabitants. Bruges had 40,000, and Ypres at the end of the 13th century had 30,000 inhabitants. And this dense urban network has had, of course, an impact on the built environment, and it generated a high demand of building materials, of which wood was one of the most important. And this may be one of the reasons for a changing building tradition, which are characterized by the use of more brick, frequent reuse of wood, building wood and other building materials, and also the use of imported woods from the Baltic region, but also from the region of the River Meuse. One of the other consequences was that Flanders was at the end of the 13th century already deforested. It was a bit comparable with the situation in Flanders today. There has also always been an interest in medieval buildings. One of the examples is Armand Hayes, who wrote a book about the cellars of Ghent, Le Crypte Cave de Ghent, and he also had attention for wooden structures. The first excavated remains of wooden buildings in Flanders are the wooden houses found in the 1950s in Antwerp. These were excavated by Adelbrecht van de Walle, and after that there were some sporadic finds of wooden constructions, but it was really waiting till the implementation of the Treaty of La Valletta, in which was said that archaeological remains that needed to be investigated, and so that's was one of the things that's there was a data growth at the moment, and it enables us to give an overview of the construction techniques and use of wood in buildings in late medieval Flanders. There are some, but before I can dive into these construction techniques, I have to say something about archaeological wood itself. Wood only preserves in subsoil and very wet to waterlogged conditions. And there are in fact three categories, big categories of preserved building wood in those contexts. It can be that it's still in situ as a foundation. An example you can see over here. These are sills on which a post stood, and these are the lower parts of the construction. What you also can see over here are some tubs that probably were used by a tanner or by the dyers of a cloth. Another context is in fact the reuse of wood. This can use an example of this can you see over here. It's in fact wood that is reused in the quays and revetments of the river Yperlee and Ypres. These were constructed in the 13th century because the wood is then dendrochronological dated. And probably was probably this wood was came from buildings and small wooden chips. Wood can also be preserved in as burnt material, as charcoal, and you can see two examples of that over here. Oh, on the first picture, some posts of a wall are visible, and on the right you can see the remains of a burnt door or shutter of a window from Ronse. So I picked Ypres as a case study because of the unique preservation of the site due to the waterlogged subsoil of the alluvial plain of the Ypres of the river. Most people know Ypres from its destruction during World War I, but it only had a limited impact on the archaeological levels, who in fact are very well preserved. The oldest excavated buildings date back to the 13th century and were made using an Earthfast post construction. The posts are driven or buried into the soil, as you can see on those images. And its strength depends completely on the type, on the soil type, where the lower mostly pointed end is driven or dug into. And of course, also the depth of the posts. Those vertical posts were the longest bearing structures of the building. But one of the downsides of this construction method is that due to the direct contact with the soil, the posts began to rot, and therefore the lifespan of this buildings is only limited to more or less 30 years. The data for Ypres were also used in 2009 to publish a dendrochronological curve for the county of Flanders. And this data shows that no pre-13th century buildings are excavated yet in Ypres, but that older construction wood from the 10th till the 12th century was used in those 13th century buildings. The study also showed that most of the load-bearing posts were made out of local oak, and other wood sorts were also present in the form of common alder and in lesser amounts ash, willow, and birch. Two growth patterns are also discernible. The first is relatively young trees with wide growth rings, and these trees have known a managed and vigorous growth, probably linked with copicing. The older trees were, older and had smaller growth rings, and these trees came from a densely covered forest, and the latter had become rare in Flanders, hence the use of the fast-growing trees. Imported wood has also been found as wooden planks from 13th century coffins in the cemetery of St. Nicholas Parish, also in Ypres. And these planks were made of Baltic wood and were probably imported as wooden boards and not as the stem, but just as the planks, as the boards. I will give you one example of a site, and this is one of the most important. It was excavated around 2000 on the site of a new hotel, a Novotel hotel in Ypres. Initially, the site existed of three big plots with a central building made in ironstone. This is one of the buildings, this is another one. And during the 13th century, these plots were divided into smaller parcels and wooden buildings were constructed on it. Two elongated built with the fronts perpendicular to the street. These two have traces of manure in it, so possible these were stable houses, and this is in fact the same as was used in the countryside. One smaller building and this one, and two houses were also constructed between the two ironstone buildings. And the house, one house had a small outbuilding, probably a bedchamber, and the posts configuration consisted of regularly placed double posts, as you can see on the picture, on which tie beams and roofing structure rested. The regularity of the structure points in the direction of a tie beam truss that was used to construct the roofing. The smaller of the two buildings had been petrified during the 13th century by in fact surrounding the wooden posts with brick walls. And if you can see that on this picture, you can see in fact the wooden posts that are really in the brick walls of the later building. Wood was also used for smaller outbuildings. You can see one over here that in fact is placed over a ditch but it was also used for smaller things like fences. And over here you can see an example of that. This effect was a fence made of small wooden posts and wattle. And in the local dialect, these were known as tuinen, which means effect in modern Dutch garden. Okay, then another house was excavated, and this shows more or less what would have been an average house in Ypres at that period of time in the 13th century. It consisted of two or more or less equal rooms divided by a partition wall of vertically placed wooden boards. The building was probably 8 to 9 meters long and minimal 3 meters wide. The outer walls consisted of round and square posts put into a foundation trench and further driven into the soil. These posts carried the frame of the roofing structure, and the space in between was filled in with vertically placed boards. You can see that over here in a section of parts of the wall. During the 13th century, the wooden load-bearing posts were placed on a padstone or rectangular brick foundation. This extended the lifespan of the wooden building substantially because the direct contact with the soil was gone, so the structure could be used longer. And towards the end of the 13th century, this evolved into a real timber framing technique. The timber frame has no direct connection with the soil, and wooden construction rests on a base or a plinth in stone. Its stability comes entirely from the frame and the wooden joints that hold it together. The panels in between the posts were filled with wattle and daub, wooden boards, bricks, or natural stones. And there are two types of timber frame structures in Flanders, one based on trusses, corbeelgestel in Dutch, and one based on a sill beam construction. In the latter building technique, sill beams rest on framed walls and are held together by superimposed tie beams. On these tie beams rest the roof. On the miniature on the right, you can see the construction of this type of houses. The archaeological reflection of those houses are small, low walls of reused building materials as excavated in Ypres. And some of these buildings consisted of two rooms, just as the wooden house that you saw earlier. This is another example from Sluis, which shows a well-preserved urban quarter organized along the road. And these are, again, stone foundations on which wooden buildings rested. This timber-framed houses evolved into brick houses with tiled roofs, but the front of the houses still was made out of wood. And this was, in fact, the most common building technique till the end of the 16th century. And these wooden fronts were gradually replaced with brick fronts by the beginning of the First World War in Ypres. All but one of these fronts were disappeared, and the last one disappeared, of course, during the First World War. Then a quick comparison with Aalst, which we can see that over there, it's a smaller town in Flanders, and we can see that another building tradition was in use over there during the 12th and the 13th century. They already used timber frame constructions. As I already said, in Ypres, Earthfast posts were still in use. The houses were built using loam floors, central hearths, and thatched or tiled roofs. And during the second half of the 14th century, the building tradition also changed, and brick sill walls and chimneys against the wall were used. So we see again a petrification of the wooden buildings. And during the 15th and the 16th century, this continued, and small continuous row houses of two rooms in brick were the most common type. Then I will end my presentation with a short excursion to Bruges. Bruges was in the late Middle Ages one of the most important towns of Northwestern Europe. It was an international port that linked the Italian and the Hanseatic markets. And written sources give a first impression of the building techniques and the urban environment of this town. You can see a couple of Dutch words, and these are in fact, these are effects from rents, and gives some indications. We can see wooden fronts with a ground floor and stone. What we can also see is that there also were stone houses granulated, like a castle. So these were stone houses. The iconography shows wooden fronts with boarded walls, a ground floor with counters, as you can see over here from a miniature. The top of the roofs existed out of gabled fronts with Gothic trefoil boards, as you can see over here. You can also see that in the famous Ghent altarpiece, which shows a cityscape of Ghent or Bruges. In Bruges, also timber frame structures are also on the inside of buildings, and some are preserved, and the oldest date back to the 13th century. These consist of some consecutive couples of wooden posts and horizontal crossbeams joined together by a brace with a mortise and tenon joint. These beams could be reinforced with a corbel piece that helps to distribute the pressure. The combination of two posts, a crossbeam and a brace, is called in Dutch a corbeelgestel. So this is a corbeelgestel. The construction is held together by the joist braces in the walls and wind braces in the roof construction. This is one of the two preserved wooden fronts from Bruges, and I will just highlight two things about it. One of the things that was studied is that the wooden boards on the inside and the outside of the walls were made out of planks from the Baltic area, and in between those wooden boards, the walls were isolated with blocks of peat, as you can see over here. And all these sources are used to make were used to make a VR reconstruction of parts of Bruges. Here you can see the ancient Bourse Square, and this is shown as an example. And this was in fact the commercial heart of Bruges. The residences of the Venetian, Florentine, and Genoese traders were built in brick or natural stone, but almost all the other buildings had a wooden front. And with this image, I would like to end my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Lennert. I have a very small query that I just wanted to know about these woods that you have shown. Do you think they were part of the frame, or were they used as foundations, sort of a thing? No? In your earlier slides that you have shown, because in India, basically the monuments, they have these linear piles which are used as foundations. So
yeah, that's also in more wet stones. For example, wooden posts were in fact used to found brick and stone walls on. That's also used in Flanders.
Yeah. Okay. So if there's no question, we can thank Mr. Lennert for a very, very important topic that he has covered and very interesting talk that he has given. Very, very informative. Thank you very much, Mr. Lennert.